Hello and welcome to another wonderful installment of the UK and Changing Europe Lunch Hour. Today we are discussing the very topical and important issue of referendums, asking referendums no more. Should we not be thinking about any future referendum here in the UK after the experiences that we've had over the last decade? Joining me today are three fantastic experts to bring you up to date and talk about all the nuances of the topic. We have Dr. Joseph Ward at the Department of Politics and International Relations of the University of Sheffield. We have Professor Meg Russell, Professor of British and Comparative Politics and Director of the Constitution Unit at UCL. And we have Professor Matt Qvortrup, the Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Coventry University. I'm going to kick off with an incredibly simple, straightforward, and in no way controversial question, and say, what are the key lessons or key insights that we have gleaned after the experiences of the Scottish independence referendum in 2014 and the, in no way controversial, Brexit referendum in 2016? Joe, I'm going to push it to you first. What do you think?
Thanks very much, Joelle, and thanks to the panel and to the UK and Changing Europe for putting on the event and for inviting me to speak. So I think looking at those two cases, it's almost, I would argue, a case of the best and the worst, potentially. In that, to start with Scotland, which might seem sort of counterintuitive given the seismic impact of 2016 on the UK political system. But some of the aspects of the 2014 Indie Ref vote, I think, demonstrated really good practice in terms of how referendums might be done, particularly in the broader context of how they have been done historically in Britain and the UK. I think the way in which there was actually engagement through schools and votes for 16 and up was quite an interesting element, and the sustained period that was permitted in the legislation for a conversation to actually take place and some proper deliberation and discussion of the issues that might come to pass presented really good sort of practice about how we might enable sustained and proper engagement with the questions that might be put in referendums. And I think also, as I just alluded to, the actual sort of legislative structure in some ways surrounding it, I think was actually another pretty good element in trying to iron out, clarify some of the issues and the ways in which that would be governed. If we switch then over to 2016, I think you can kind of see an illustration almost of the opposite, particularly in the political conversation that went on UK-wide, the way in which that was kind of, particularly then also in terms of the legislation, how things were implemented through that legislative structure, which particularly the advisory nature of it, and also some of the sort of political elements that underpinned how that was then brought to Parliament, through Parliament, and the campaign structure as well. And I think broadly, as I know the Constitution Unit and others have kind of, and they've studied 2016 as indicative of David Cameron's style, this kind of bluff call element, I think, was particularly pronounced in the 2016 case. So we really see a kind of a strategy almost of trying to win the 2015 election, using this as a kind of element, a component of that to stave off another political party in UKIP, and then also trying to rush it through and not necessarily adhering to some elements of good practice, which there have been in the 2014 case, but also further back in UK practice. So I think you could kind of see it as best and worst if you were to look at those two particular votes.
I want to immediately bring it to the director of the Constitution Unit. Best and worst. What do you think of that analysis?
Thank you very much. Well, definitely worst. I'm not so sure about best, but I'm not such an expert on the Scottish referendum, but well, by far compared to the amount of time that I've spent thinking about the Brexit referendum, where I was a fellow with the UK and Changing Europe working on Brexit, Parliament and the Constitution. I've written a whole book about Brexit and Parliament, where Parliament came off very badly partly as a result of the way that the referendum was done. So the referendum is a key part of the Parliament story. And in terms of what we can learn in general about referendums, I think I would say one thing which is maybe slightly controversial, and we might dig into a bit more later, but one big thing I think we can learn is that referendums are, I would suggest, intrinsically or definitely have a major risk of being polarizing devices. You know, they boil down what are often very big and complex choices into a simple yes, no. And I think even if there are elements of good practice in the Scottish referendum, I think it certainly did prove to be divisive, and the divisions which came really by necessity to the fore out as a result of the Scottish people having to take that decision have not entirely gone away. And you can certainly say that over Brexit. I mean, you have the fantastic work of people like Sarah Hobolt at the LSE looking at the extent to which people's identities became polarized around leave and remain, and how that infects, the way that we deal with each other, even in terms of our family lives and so on, never minding politics. So I think that sits there, and we need to take the lesson that we need to use referendums with care, and we need to think about the risk of polarization and how we're going to try to avoid it. I think we also need to think about how they fit in. Joseph was just talking about this within our broader constitutional structure. And in particular, clearly, the thinking just didn't happen in terms of the Brexit referendum and how Parliament's role fitted in. And the big thing to take away from that is he used the term bluff call, which was a term coined by the House of Commons Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, which is ironically chaired by a well-known Brexiteer, Conservative Brexiteer, Bernard Jenkin. They were very critical of the Brexit referendum. But going into a referendum without there being a clear plan for change, if people vote for change, is an exceptionally bad idea. I mean, actually, the government forbade civil servants from preparing for a leave vote. So no preparation had been done. There wasn't even any clarity on the process that would be followed. So we immediately got into this argument about the triggering of Article 50 and whether Parliament should have a say in the trigger. And this whipped up all sorts of anti-parliamentary rhetoric and feeling that maybe Parliament was going to try and block the referendum result or something. With a bit of thought, it would have been quite possible to write into the referendum bill that the next thing that would happen would be that the government was allowed to trigger Article 50, and we could have avoided that row. We never even talked about these process points, let alone what Brexit would mean. Hard Brexit, soft Brexit, what are we going to do about Northern Ireland? The things that we spent literally years arguing over after the referendum barely featured in the referendum campaign itself. So I think that lack of preparation for the outcomes and the lack of thinking about how the referendum fits with the other processes of decision making. We might talk a little bit later on about ways of involving the public in decisions, which we've done a lot of work on at the Constitution Unit, which are more deliberative. So not just offering people a yes, no question, but offering them the chance to think through the pros and cons and the ins and outs of issues, and maybe before a referendum happens. It could be in advance of a referendum, but allowing the public to deliberate about the meaning of change and what the options are, rather than just hitting them with a yes, no. I think I've probably said enough, and I've got myself out of talking too much about Scotland, but we can come back to that. Thank you.
Well, for all those listening, we have the key lessons. You are hearing them right now. Matt, can you add these key lessons that people should be learning in the context of referendum?
Yes. Well, first of all, as I'm not a politician, I'll answer your question about can you join the EU without a referendum? And I think you asked that question before, is that right? Or
we will. I mean, for all those, we will be asking that question, my very controversial question.
Yes. And I think the very short answer to that is no. I mean, I think we need to go back to square one, or back to basics when it comes to referendums. And A.B. Dicey, who is a quite controversial but much revered constitutional scholar in late Victorian age, said that the referendum is there because it makes sure that you cannot pass into law an act with which the majority of the people do not agree. I mean, he puts it more eloquently than I just try to paraphrase there. And I think the key to the referendum is also, Dicey says, it's a people's veto. And the referendum can work well when it is a people's veto. So it's obvious, I think, now, and if we take Scotland, I've spent quite a lot of time in Scotland at the time also of the referendum. And in Scotland, it is now inconceivable that Scotland could become independent without a referendum, because it would just not be right. For starters, even at the height of their power, 35% of the SNP voters did not support independence. So there is a possibility that people can support a particular political party, but not their constitutional changes. And if we can sort of, so I think referendums are there for the big and important issues. There was a man called Tacitus, a Roman historian who traveled to these shores and then wrote back and saying, in these isles, on the small matters, the chieftains decide, but on the biggest matters, the people decide. And the referendum is there in the sort of, what did the Romans ever do for us sort of way, for the very, very big issues. When you're changing the framework, then you have to have referendums, but possibly only then. And I think if we then again go back to the thing about the Scottish referendum versus the Brexit referendum, I think in some ways, yes, the Scottish referendum was enlightened, and people. I went to a town hall meeting in Perth, and people were talking about 3 different currency options, if there should be like the Hong Kong model or the Singapore model. And that was very, very different from the Brexit referendum, where it was very polarized. But I think the Scottish referendum, even if it was higher levels of public deliberation without citizens' juries and so on, people were actually engaged in it. The SNP had published this 507-page report about the economy there. And a lot of people, including David Cameron, say, well, that's it. If they're publishing their blueprint, then people are going to see what it means and they're going to vote against it. What is interesting about the Scottish referendum is that, yes, the independistas, if we can call them that, lost the referendum, but they won the campaign. At the beginning of the campaign, support for independence was 28%, and that increased to 44%, and even a poll that had them slightly higher. So having a deliberative campaign does not mean that it's people will necessarily vote against change. But I think it also comes back to the bluff calling. Now, I should declare an interest. So I was a consultant to the Constitutional Affairs Committee at the time, not agreeing with them. And it was an interesting thing to be the neutral expert in what was basically sort of a boxing ring of arguments, with the Brexiteers being much, much, much better prepared than those who were not. And I think David Cameron, in some ways, with his bluff-calling referendums, in a way he bluff-called the Scottish referendum, and they happened to win that referendum, but not by much. And I think David Cameron has been sort of like characterized what I call the Britney Spears theory of politics. Oops, he did it again. And he just made a number of mistakes. And the second time he oopsed, he failed and paid the consequences of that. But the bluff calling of referendums hasn't really worked well for him. And it's a massive change from what it was. I was rereading the other day, and Meg and I were sort of at the same time, probably with the Labour Party and so in 1997. I think there were 4 or 5 promises of referendums in that election manifesto on electoral reform. Never happened. On the euro, never happened, and Mayor of London happened, Scotland happened, and so on. And that was, at the time, was referendums were, and of course Northern Ireland. And at the time, that was sort of like the thing to do. And I think in the meantime, referendums then suddenly blew up in people's faces again. And I'm going to be intrigued to see if there are going to be any promises for referendums in the next Labour manifesto.
We did have a very resolute promise, I think the last Conservative manifesto, not to have a divisive and acrimonious referendum again. But for those out there counting, that is the time this week that you have thought about the Romans. You probably weren't expecting to also think about Britney Spears in the same sentence. But I think what we're getting to is one of the core questions or core debates in the context of the use of referendums, which is when can you use a referendum is very different from when should you use a referendum. I want to circle back to talk a little bit about policy and polarization in a second. But could we first again try to look at those lessons on the can and the should? When should you have a referendum? Meg, let's go first to you.
Sure. Yeah. I think Matt has touched on something important in terms of, I can't remember what phrase you used now, I didn't write it down, but being a kind of veto point in the process.
Veto player.
Yeah. So I think in terms of the good and the bad, and the fact that we were talking about perhaps Scotland being the good, I think in terms of the deliberation, in some respects, good. Although I would have to say that most of the information, the very detailed information that had been put out had, of course, been put out by the people who wanted independence and was to an extent, a significant extent, disputed by the UK government that didn't want independence. And we had lots of rows about whether the things that the Scottish government was claiming should happen were possible and would happen, and so on. Some of that was even about EU membership, etc. The times when I think referendums have worked is more in the context that Matt might be hinting at, which is sort of cementing decisions which have already been through other processes. I mean, one of the problems with the Brexit referendum, it's quite bizarre to think, there never actually was a debate in Parliament as to whether we should leave the EU. There was only ever a debate as to whether we should have a referendum. I mean, this is extremely odd. If you look at other countries that use referendums, as we have been by convention, we have been using referendums on constitutional matters, really. We haven't yet used them on sort of, moral and ethical matters and that kind of, like in Ireland, that there have been some, partly because they're constitutional, actually, those questions in Ireland, and you do need a constitutional change. But in most other countries where you're looking at a constitutional change, that would need to be debated in Parliament, approved in Parliament, and then go to a referendum. And we didn't do that with respect to Brexit. But at other times when we've done referendums, we have done something more like that. So the Labour devolution referendums back in the late 1990s, there was a lot of debate about what the institution should look like, etc., before the referendum took place. Parliament was in favour of devolution. I mean, because the Labour Party was in favour of devolution, it had a huge majority. It was just a question of whether the people in Scotland and Wales thought that was okay. And if they said it was okay, it would happen. Everybody was happy to deliver it. That's a very different set of circumstances to Brexit, when Parliament is divided, it's not in favour of the change. David Cameron actually was, he was the architect of 3 major referendums. So we've referred to Scotland and Brexit, but actually in 2011, he oversaw the referendum on changing the electoral system for the House of Commons, which was, so I would say, you're quite right, I think, on Cameron, that he had 2 shots and won both times. And then Brexit was his 3rd shot and he lost, which was fairly catastrophic for all concerned. But on the first attempt, the referendum on introducing the alternative vote for the House of Commons, there was actually an entire bill which set out all of the detail of how the electoral system would work. And if the referendum had been approved, that bill would have come into effect and the voting system would have changed. There would have been no further argument about the rights or wrongs or hows of implementation. That is a safe use, I think, of referendums. So they shouldn't be the beginning of a process. They should be the end of a process, and they should be cementing the decisions that come out of more deliberative political discussions in Parliament and among the people, and then offer the sort of seal of approval to legitimate the decision that's been taken and to make it more difficult to reverse. So, it would have been much more difficult. Well, we haven't seen a reversal of devolution, but it might have been easier to reverse devolution if it hadn't been cemented by those referendums back in the 1990s. That's appropriate, but this most recent use with Brexit in particular is very, very different.
We're certainly going to circle back to the question of direct democracy. And I'm seeing on Slido that there's a lot of questions that go to this of how to make deliberative democracy realized within the UK system. But just on that question again of when should we be seeing a referendum take place, I want to bring in Joe.
Yeah, there's a few different points that have come up from the conversation. I think it's interesting that Matt mentioned Dicey. I know that you're very well aware of this, Matt. But Dicey was advocating the referendum for quite clearly political reasons as well when he made the intellectual case for it he was particularly against Home Rule in Ireland and that massive debate that kind of shook the constitutional structure at the beginning of the 20th century and before and continues to in various ways. And I think there's there's a question there within which is broader and goes to the kind of constitutional foundations of the UK, which is how can you kind of control this political repurposing of the referendum for that by various actors for various ends, and how far along the road to sort of codification of different elements of that process do you go? And I think obviously one of the kind of key outcomes of the independent commission that Meg's unit ran was to try and think about ways in which those different processes, different steps in a process could be ironed out. Can we have legislation that can try and clarify that? And you know, if there's still an intention to maintain a sort of political constitution with political checks and balances, referendums might play quite a valuable role in that. But can we balance that with going too far or not far enough along the road to codification? So it's that balance, I think, of, you know, can we actually mute the political purposing of the referendum for different ends in some way or another? I don't know if we can within the current constitutional structure, but I think that's important when considering when it's appropriate for one to be held. I think another thing that's come out of that comparison of 2014 in Scotland and 2016 on EU membership is thinking a bit about whether the issue is salient anyway amongst the public. So Meg just referred to kind of how we get that deliberative element working and how we get people engaged in a conversation. And the kind of really interesting thing, I suppose, various ways about EU membership before 2016 is, although more people were voting for Eurosceptic parties, or UKIP at least, the salience of the issue actually wasn't that high in terms of the way in which, I suppose, I don't actually have the stats on me, but the way in which I guess nationalism in Scotland and a campaign for independence was kind of quite a pertinent political conversation that was happening anyway. So maybe there's something there about sort of organic nature of a conversation that people want to engage with, and whether they're getting information from one side or another and how they deliberate and evaluate that, they're already starting to form their own opinions. So I think some way of trying to understand and evaluate the salience of issues that are then being asked and put to the public is an important consideration in whether they're just being used by elites as a tool to try and secure particular electoral imperatives, or to call bluff on a particular issue or political party, or whether there's actually going to be more of a kind of proper engagement and a democratic process through which people can have a say and be directly involved as a veto player, if we've got that kind of more clear structure around the stages and processes through which referendums come to be held. And the final point I'd make on that is just to bring it to Northern Ireland. I suppose that's interesting in relation to the salience point, in that in the Good Friday Agreement there is obviously this issue of the Secretary of State being able to determine when another border poll may be held in Northern Ireland, dependent on their judgment, basically, of the demand for that vote. And I think that presents lots of other interesting questions, because in a sense it returns quite a bit of power to the Secretary, well, a lot of power to the Secretary of State to determine it, and the government to determine it as and when. But it does raise lots of questions about how polling, how different maybe deliberative instruments or engagement with the devolved administrations, how these different factors then feed into determining whether a threshold has been reached upon which a vote should be held. And that context and case is particularly important, given, as Meg was outlining, the absolute lack of thought about what might happen in that territory and area of the UK in the aftermath of 2016, which became such a huge issue and obviously has all sorts of implications. So I think there's those different kind of points to consider at any point as to whether there should be a vote on a particular issue.
Joe, you are wonderfully answering questions that are coming up on Slido without even me asking them. So I'm very, very impressed by you being aware of things that you were not asked. But this also goes to one of the questions I'm seeing, which is electoral salience, or how much do the electorate actually know about the question that they're being asked? Can they be said to be reliably enough informed as voters to vote? But Matt, can I ask you to feed in on just to the discussions that we had so far on this question of when should a referendum be called? Oh, Matt, you are muted, I'm afraid.
I thought over COVID, no, we got over that. Anyway, I think referendums should definitely be called when you are changing the framework. It's sort of like, you know, these are sort of the equivalent of getting rid of the offside rule in football or things like that. And you have to have an overall agreement on that. So from a sort of jurisprudence point of view, the thing they called an overlapping consensus, and a constitution should be the overlapping consensus. Never mind what you put into policy, but the framework should be agreed. The electoral system, the divisions of powers, whether federal or not federal, and so on. And those things should be ought to be put to a referendum, which was also Dicey's. I mean, Dicey had a sinister motive, but I think, and one that I happen to disagree with. But he was talking about sort of changing the House of Lords, Bill of Rights, the monarchy, and things like that should be called to a referendum. And of course, that's more difficult when we, like New Zealand, for example, don't have a written constitution. New Zealand is struggling with the same problem. So constitutional changes are the ones that should be put to a referendum. And referendums shouldn't really be used for party political purposes. And it's interesting, if we're looking at the actual 4 referendums that David Cameron held, we always, in this part of the world, forget about Wales. And Wales had a referendum. The first thing they had, where they changed from having only the power, the Welsh Assembly could only pass secondary statutory instruments, secondary legislation, and they could then start to be able to pass primary legislation, which passed. And that was a classic constitutional referendum. It was held because that was right and proper and constitutional. Then the AB referendum was a strategic referendum. The parties couldn't agree. They kicked it out in the long grass, rather than they had, like Labour had done in 1975, where the Labour Party couldn't agree to disagree by kicking it out into the long grass of a referendum. And then we had the last 2 Britney Spears type of referendums, where they were supposed to solve a problem, and you actually create another. But it led to the resurgence of the SNP, and I have it on good authority that Salmon knew that he wasn't going to win this one. But he says, but this means that I will be able to, and I think the phrase that he used was to put a kilt around it, and basically, which is a wonderful Scottish way of saying anything that makes you sort of be able to sound more Scottish. And then suddenly the Labour Party almost disappeared. Well, disappeared pretty much in Scotland, because he could now be the person who could speak for Scotland, or certainly for the independistas in Scotland. So we had 3 different types of referendums. We had the strategic referendum, which is the agree to disagree referendum, and we had the referendum that was supposed to solve a problem that then made it much worse. And I think that when we should not have referendums is when politicians think they can gain from it. François Mitterrand in France had decided to split the opposition by having a referendum on the Maastricht Treaty, and it almost blew up in his face. Then Jacques Chirac, who was one of the people who should have the split in the opposition in 2005, thought he could gain popularity by having a referendum on the European Constitution, and which also blew up in his face. So whenever politicians are allowed to have referendums for tactical purposes, they tend to blow up. And we, rather like the French, have this plebiscitarian use of the referendum, where the executive can say, "Oh, we want to have a referendum now," and that normally blows up in their faces. Like Matteo Renzi in 2016 as well ended his political career because he thought he was very popular to have a referendum on the constitution, which he didn't really want to have. And then suddenly it turned sour for him, and he said, "Oh, I'm not going to resign anyway." And he made that a referendum on his own popularity, which then was rather lower than he thought. So I think we should not have referendums when they are like the party political ones that would be for tactical purposes. But we must have referendums when people are trying to for want of a better word, gerrymander the constitution. Now, the problem then, if I can just, sorry if I'm rambling on some, but I've spent the last 9 months in a place called Australia. And in Australia, they have very polarized politics. And whenever they change the constitution, which they've tried to do on 45 occasions since independence or federation, it's only succeeded in 8 cases. And on this goes back to Meg's point, on very mundane issues like retirement of judges or votes for the territories or things like that. But only on issues. And last year we had the referendum on recognition of Aboriginals and giving them a voice to Parliament. I was part of a survey we're working on at the moment. We asked 15,000 people about it. And what was interesting about that was we thought there was all going to be populism, but actually people deliberated pretty well. And so we can't really see that certain groups should have extra say here. So even if that's been portrayed in the international press insofar as they have written about Australia as their Brexit moment, it probably was rather more deliberative, or people certainly thought more about it than we might have given them credit for. But going back to my fundamental point, changes of the constitution ought to be put to a referendum. The use of party political referendum should be avoided.
I think we can happily debate whether or not every decision ultimately made by a politician to put anything to a vote is necessarily political and for political gain. But we'll pause that for a second, because I actually want to dig down again on this theme that keeps coming up, which is polarization. So let's in fact take constitutional questions to one side for a moment and look at the policy. So there's two parts to this. First, necessarily, are we always going to see a polarization if a question is put to the people? But second, are there any policy questions that we think should be put to a referendum? Is there a good in putting, say, net zero as a policy question to the people? Matt, I'm going to stick with you.
Yes, I think it's important that we have a distinction between policy and politics. So policy issues are the ones where we try to solve a problem, and politics issues are the ones where we try to win the argument. And we don't really sort of focus too much on policy. When policy issues, which are mundane issues where we try to solve a problem, are put to the people, then they tend to do rather better. I think the Danes had a referendum on patents, and they had another referendum on royal succession, so if females should, and that became a big debate about equality rights. And in Ireland, you had one on adoption, which was just a technical policy issue, and therefore people tried to discuss. And what was interesting, I thought, about the Irish referendum on abortion was that it became not an issue about either or, but a question of where do we draw the line. And that was very much a policy debate. In Ireland, as I started doing my PhD the year when Ireland voted for the first abortion one, and there was a very polarized debate, and there was a case of X who couldn't travel to England to have an abortion, and it was almost deliberately done to polarize Ireland, because the people then in power were more conservative on social issues and wanted that polarization, whereas the case of the sort of the lead up to the referendum on abortion in Ireland was this poor Indian woman who had died. And people said, well, that's obviously wrong. And there was an outrage that she would die and the circumstances of that. But people still weren't comfortable with having perhaps a very liberal regime of abortion. So therefore, that debate was very mature, because they were trying to not win the argument, but trying to figure out where on a continuum do we want to draw the line. And citizens' juries can help us turn from politics into policy. And I think we have to, I mean, it's a general sort of, I sound a bit sort of well-being therapy class now, but I think as overall in our political life, we have to start thinking more about what exactly is the problem we're trying to solve, rather than how am I going to win the argument. So I've been screaming at my radio set this morning, hearing that Trump is winning. But that's actually, I'm trying to figure out where we're trying to solve the problem. And when we end up in a debate, which we had with Brexit, it was not, I mean, as Meg said before, it wasn't about the issues. It was just like, I'm in the Remain camp, I'm in the Leave camp, and I hate you because of that, and I'm not going to talk to you. And we probably had that in our own daily lives. I'm not suggesting where you might have voted on this one, but it certainly wasn't what is the problem we're trying to solve. And if we'd gone back to being more focused on policy beforehand, we probably wouldn't have ended up in that case. And when I've been in Scotland recently, I've talked to SNP voters and the opposite side and said, well, okay, what is the issue that really concerns you? And then in a Scottish accent, I can't do. Then you're told that the NHS, it's all of these things. And then saying, well, how is that going to be solved with that? And then there are people who say, oh, if the Scottish Parliament could only decide, we wouldn't be driven by all of that. But let's focus on policy issues. Let's say, what is the problem we're trying to solve, and what's our proposed solution? And what can we learn from other people? So we have got too much shouting and talking and too little listening. And a good democratic system is one where there's a feedback loop, where we learn from the discussions and the deliberations. And I mean, I know that splatter will get me nowhere, but Ireland has really shown the way with citizens' juries. I mean, it's not a panacea by any stretch of the imagination, but it certainly it's a massive contrast to the referendum in Australia last year, where they would not have a citizens' jury, and the Brexit referendum where also emphatic there wasn't.
Well, I'm sincerely hoping by the end of this single hour of lunch, we do provide or design that panacea for the ideal referendum of the UK. But I do just want to continue digging down on this question of polarization and policy. Meg, could I bring you in?
Yeah, I'm struck listening to some of the other contributions that there's a really obvious point, which is another kind of innate characteristic of referendums, aside from their ability to polarize between different camps in the public. Of course, one of the other things that they often do is offer people an opportunity which they gladly take to kick the politicians. So, you know, why did the AV referendum fail so badly? It was an opportunity for people to kick Nick Clegg in part. It didn't help that he'd called the thing they were holding the referendum on a miserable little compromise. That wasn't the best advertisement for it, because of course he wanted to go further and have a proportional system, but people quite enjoyed saying no to Nick Clegg. It's interesting that Labour's devolution programme ended in 2004 with the referendum on an elected assembly in the northeast, where the no campaign was headed, I believe, certainly he was a very active part of it, by Dominic Cummings, who turned it into an anti-politician referendum. Do you really need more politicians? You know, they've had a great big balloon in the shape of a white elephant and so on, and that got voted down. Then Matt referred to Matteo Renzi, who I think the Italian public, they probably didn't fully understand the details of that constitutional reform package, but they saw it as an opportunity to kick a politician. In Ireland, actually, there's an interesting case where there was also a referendum on the abolition of the second chamber, which the assumption at the beginning was that because the second chamber contained politicians, the public would leap at the chance to abolish it and get rid of politicians. But actually, they decided instead to kick the politicians who had provided them with the referendum, because they were naturally suspicious of why they were being asked this question, and that the second chamber was at least some check on politicians. So they surprisingly voted to keep it. So I think that's the thing that politicians also need to be very careful of. We need to be careful of coming up with referendums which are going to be divisive among the people, but also of creating mechanisms which just become a stick to beat the politicians themselves with. And I think one of the ways of avoiding all of that is for politicians for referendums to not just be one-off devices, as I've already said, but effectively be part of a continuing dialogue on a topic. And I think, you know, the example that you gave was net zero, which is a slightly strange example. And I suppose I can't ask you as the chair what the referendum would be, but, you know, are we voting to say, yes, we want to reach a net zero target? Because if we start with that, we're effectively doing what we did with Brexit by potentially setting an impossible target for the politicians to follow through on. Or do the politicians come up with a plan and ask us whether we're prepared to accept it, a plan that they think is viable? Now, I think that would be a more sensible use of a referendum. I'm not sure it's necessary, but it would be better than the alternative. Another alternative is that, you know, frankly, when I think about the Brexit referendum happening now, I think it's all a bit mad. The idea that before we've had any discussion as a country about the ins and outs of being in Europe, and what being outlined might mean and the implications for all sorts of things. We don't have that conversation. We just rush straight to yes, no. If you were doing it again now on something, I think you would set up a citizens' assembly or a series of citizens' assemblies. You'd ask people. I mean, there has been a climate change assembly with Parliament trying to get people to deliberate on what the options are and what the public would accept. It wouldn't be perhaps unreasonable as the final stage of that process, if there has been a citizens' assembly on something very complicated and sensitive. Another example might be assisted dying, say, where the politicians are frightened of taking the decision. They're frightened of the backlash. It's not very party political, but if members of the public are brought together to deliberate and give it really serious thought and come up with a proposal, which is effectively what happened a lot of these times in Ireland, that the final step is for that to get the seal of approval by the public in a referendum. That's also it's less likely to polarize, and it's less likely to turn into a kicking back against the politicians, because it's the people who've come up with the proposals which are then put to the people for endorsement. That feels a much more safe environment and a much more sensible way to develop policy than rushing into a yes, no, and then asking the politicians to deliver what the public has asked for.
Joe, bringing you in, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Meg and Matt have both done a really good job of giving an overview there. Just recount points on deliberation and citizens' assemblies and juries and the like. But I guess another point there is that their involvement, particularly in the Irish case and in, I guess, some other cases, is that there is just that added legitimacy. Not only is it you're not kicking a proposal that's come directly from some political elite, but it's part of the body of citizens of which you are part that I guess have come up with this particular set of proposals or have had some contribution in determining what's put in front of people to ratify or to veto. To use that language, I guess there's the added legitimacy coming from it as well, which I think is very important. But I guess it's difficult to kind of think about connecting the anti-political stuff that we're talking about here and the polarization and also the policy element. And I think that distinction between politics and policy is obviously important. But I was struck, I don't want to keep just plugging constitution unit stuff. That's what Meg's here to do. So I just thought I'd brush up a little bit on some of the work that you were doing at the Constitution Unit recently on the democracy in the UK sort of survey work. And it struck me. So there's still this when there's polling done on referendums, people kind of seem like they do want to have some involvement when they're asked a sort of basic question about it in the UK. It then gets a bit more fuzzy when you drill down into it and the scenarios in which you propose it. But the thing that exists alongside it is also a lot of distrust still, right? So we have a huge amount of distrust in the system. And I think the thing is that occurred to me is kind of also if we want people to engage more either through deliberative mechanisms or direct democratic mechanisms of participation, we have this question of why would anyone want to participate more in a system that you don't trust? Right. So people often kind of say, well, I kind of want more referendums maybe, but I also don't know if I want to participate more. So there's all these kind of conflicting answers. And it seems to me in the sort of policy realm, aside from that more sort of clear processes outlined of how deliberative mechanisms can come into that, I think there's also a way of maybe learning from the local a little bit. So we do have now kind of quite extensive provision for local votes in legislation in the UK at local government level. And I'm conscious that, local government's kind of subject to legislation coming down from the centre, and it's also getting kind of killed by austerity, and there's all these pressures, and now there's popular votes that they have to try and implement and adhere to. But in Sheffield, we had, I think, the first example of an initiative, a bottom-up movement, which led to a referendum through reaching the threshold for a petition, which was held in 2021 to move from a cabinet-led model in the council to a committee-led model. And that's got all its problems in terms of the process that's then ensued and the party politics that are involved with it. But I think unearthing some of these examples from the local level are quite interesting in thinking about, is there any way we can channel some of the distrust and anti-political sentiment that is there in a way that allows citizens to maybe make proposals in a direct democratic way, not just through deliberative mechanisms? So I think that maybe that's sort of also something for us to think about because I think there's a lot of so one of the provisions is through tax. There's a lot of toxicity around sort of council tax proposals in England. At the moment, we're going to have lots of hikes in council tax going through, but there's a threshold set there by the centre, which means that a referendum has to be held. And that exerts a sort of, I guess, a role in preventing people going to those levels. But I know that in Wales, there's a few proposals at the moment where that isn't the case. And so higher council tax rises are going through. And then the political forces start to circle. I know Taxpayers Alliance are starting a sort of thing around, I think, Pembrokeshire and some of the places are proposing quite high council tax hikes. But all of that is to say, even though the politics continues to circle in that local arena, and it's a very tough context for local government to be operating in at the moment, I do think there are some examples in that area where, in both the decision-making process overall and maybe policy measures, there's something that could be learned.
We'll definitely come back to examples of good practice. But Ireland has come up quite a lot in the discussion so far. And a wonderful coincidence, Ireland is having, I think, 2 referendums this week. So we are very, very good timing for talking about it. But it also serves as another example of the electorate being re-asked the same question until, quote, they get the right answer. And this is on the EU treaties about a decade or two ago. Decade ago. My history is not as good as it should be. So first, the controversial question that Matt presaged at the beginning, and I'm just going to ask this to Meg. Do we have to ask the electorate again to join the EU? Does there have to be a second EU referendum were the electorate to ever decide to rejoin the EU? Meg.
Interesting question. Let me again preface what I'm saying with a slight diversion, which is thank you so much, Joe, for plugging all of our work. You have plugged the Independent Commission on Referendums, whose report can be found on the Constitution Unit website, and also the Democracy in the UK After Brexit project, which has done a lot of polling and also held a citizens' assembly on futures. We also, incidentally, in this field, have our working group on unification referendums on the island of Ireland, because, of course, you mentioned we're talking about Ireland, but we're not talking about that aspect. But if we're talking about, particularly as a fallout from Brexit, whether there might be other referendums down the road, it's not just Scotland, it's Northern Ireland that we maybe need to think about. We've got a whole report on that. I mean, in the Independent Commission report, we look at the way that referendums have been used in the UK. And obviously, we have no written constitution. We have the freedom of Parliament to call referendums on what it wants, when it wants. But we do have some sort of conventions that have developed, one of which is that issues of devolution will go to referendum, issues of the electoral system will go to referendum. Of course, those conventions can be broken, but the more they become habits, they're harder to break. And of course, 2 of the 3 nationwide referendums that we've held have been on membership of the European institutions, the EEC, and then the EU. So there's nothing to say that we would have to legally have a referendum if we were to rejoin. But I think there would be a reasonable expectation that, having held 2 referendums on it in the past, that it would be a bit strange to shift away from that. But also, I think the politicians, the way that we're saying that referendums work is when the politicians use them to get public backing for the thing that they already think is the sensible thing to do. So if we did in the future have a government that thought that rejoining the EU was a sensible thing, in a way you take some of the political toxicity out of it by checking that the public are on your side, rather than doing it without asking them and risking that there's a backlash and people say that that isn't what people really wanted. So I think that a lot of this, in terms of sensible use of referendums, is getting politicians working with people, getting processes working together, multi-stage processes and so on. So we're all pushing in the same direction, rather than setting politicians against people. And I think that at this stage, politicians trying to enter the EU without asking people might be seen as them setting themselves against people. Whereas if a future government said, we think we should rejoin the EU, here are the arguments in favour, what do you all think? Obviously, they have to risk the possibility that the public says no, but if they've got a convincing case and the public says yes, then you've got a very secure political decision. So I'd say, yes, you could do it, but it wouldn't be sensible.
Thank you. Continuing the same theme, and I'm going to pick up quite a few questions at once that have come up on Slido, and they're talking about international examples. Essentially, do other countries do it better? We have Switzerland, we've already been talking about Ireland, and New Zealand that are being mentioned. But Matt, do other countries, well, what lessons can we get from other countries? For example, another one of our questions from Slido is about quorum. Should there be minimum voting turnout or minimum thresholds that have to be met? Could you talk about other countries' best practice that we can learn from? Matt, I'm terribly sorry, you're yet again muted.
Sorry. Yeah, so the minimum thresholds are quite controversial in a way, because they're in all the German Länder, they have referendums, and they have them quite often, and they're always pretty much invalidated by a low turnout. In Italy, you have to have a turnout of over 50% for that to be valid, and most of the so-called citizens of the abrogative referendum abrogativo in Italian, have been invalidated by that. And people only vote for those when it's really, really super important. So when a prime minister wanted to have immunity for prime ministers for prosecution, it was called Silvio Berlusconi, people then abrogated that law with 97%, and that actually made it. So maybe a turnout of 50 would not be a bad idea, but there's a question mark over that. Then if we take other countries, do they do it better? Well, Ireland clearly does it better because there are the citizens' juries that make these issues into policy rather than politics. New Zealand, Meg mentioned assisted dying as a case. Another one was marijuana, which they had a referendum on. They voted against marijuana, but for assisted dying, because that was an issue that wasn't party political. So I think in a way, New Zealand has done better than certainly we have here, and that's also a country without a written constitution. So in some ways, that is in a way the only comparable example that we have. Then there's the issue, which I think we obviously had the Sheffield one on local government, and a lot of people like the idea of citizens-initiated referendums, saying, well, this undiluted will of the people and so on. I think what the lesson has been from especially countries in Central and Eastern Europe is that they tend to be hijacked by the opposition party. So in Slovenia, for example, and Slovakia, and also to a degree in Croatia, the opposition parties have then used, when they're in opposition, the referendum or the citizen-initiated referendum to find an issue that makes the government very unpopular. And in Croatia, they abolished the threshold of 50%, and then the opposition party wanted to introduce a law that defined marriage only as between men and women. And certainly you had the culture war there, and that was passed, and it became, and they've had that in Slovakia as well, where it didn't pass because of the threshold thing. But in those countries, the referendum has been used or abused as a vehicle to solidify support. And much as Switzerland is sort of like always praised, Switzerland has the permanent coalition government, but then to stand out, the People's Party in Switzerland have often used quite xenophobic referendums, which they won't get passed, but they then solidify the base, and they sort of can sort of speak with a purpose. So those citizen-initiated referendums, I think, while they seem like the undiluted will of the people, are actually more like party political vehicles. And it requires the organization of a political party to even get one started. So they aren't really, Switzerland had this sort of famous vote about abolishing the army, and there was a man called Bruno Kaufmann who was, 18 years old, who didn't want to serve, and he gathered all the signatures. I mean, that's a very nice one to pick out, and they always use that one. But I think, as a general rule, citizens-initiated referendums were invented to be the voice of the people, and they have increasingly become the vehicle of parties.
I think that's actually a wonderful note to bring in my final question to the whole panel, which is picking up on so many of the themes that we had throughout, the idea of citizens' assemblies, deliberative direct democracy and its role in the UK, and that panacea of can we design something? Can we think of a way to design the use of referendums and everything going into that ultimate question in a way that will be only helpful to the management, the governance, and the future of the UK? Jo, it's not an easy question to end on, but I'm still going to begin with you. Design the perfect referendum structure.
Thanks very much. I don't know if I can take on that task of designing a perfect referendum structure, but in terms of overall sort of practice, I think the thing is, and it's a point that's been made in other contributions, to kind of, I mean, if we're thinking about referendum futures almost in the UK, as has been mentioned, I think it's very difficult to see a future in which they don't play a part. There are so many precedents now for votes on various issues. There's a lot of legitimacy concerns around a vote decided, whether it's EU membership again or Northern Ireland or Scotland or whatever, that another vote isn't held. So I think it's almost about thinking about a way to routinize the practice or find a way to build it into a kind of broader process or set stage processes, wherein people are going to have input at maybe one stage and another at the end in ratifying it, all through a deliberation, some sort of forum in the middle of it, in that translation that Matt's talking about in terms of from politics to policy. So the only issue that we then come up against is that you have an uncodified constitutional system across the UK, and that it's how do you then try and impose control around what is effectively politics or political accountability and responsibility that is at the end of the process and the ultimate form of accountability as opposed to legal. So I think whether you just propose that through legislation, whether you strengthen some of the bodies or institutions like the Electoral Commission that are charged with attempting to do that, I guess is the most likely route. But I think that the main thing that we've got to try and do is find a way to routinize that practice at local level, as I've sort of advocated for, whether through citizens' initiatives or otherwise. I think that's important for people getting used to actually being engaged and practicing and being involved in these decisions and events. And then thinking about the broader structure, how we kind of combine deliberative and direct democratic processes to encourage people to have say and to be involved in that translation process from politics to policy.
Meg, over to you on these key recommendations.
Well, I pretty much agree with everything that Jo has said. And of course, I'd plug the report of the Independent Commission on Referendums, which I made around about 70 recommendations, having thought long and hard about these questions. I think in terms of the topic, please no more bluff call referendums. As we've said, that too often people have reached for referendums to break kind of political impasse, to deal with party management. Even the one in 1975 was about Harold Wilson trying to manage his party rather than the public necessarily needing to take that decision at that time. But I think that sometimes where you want a decision to be lasting, where it needs to go beyond the lifetime of one government and beyond one political party, there may be a need for a seal of approval by the public through a referendum in order to sort of concretize, legitimize the decision that's been taken. But I think it should be part of a careful multi-stage process. I think there should be other ways of involving the public through deliberative processes as well as just a yes/no. And I think that the campaign itself needs to offer people high quality, trustworthy information upon which they can make their decision. And that's very tricky. One of the things that the Independent Commission floated was the idea that you might actually hold deliberative processes among the public to try and work on the material that is circulated to other members of the public in order to make the decision, so that the information that people are sent is more trusted. They don't see it as just coming from the politicians, but as having been thought through by people like them who can maybe put it in their own language and get it away from the sort of political bun fight. So I think involving the public in various ways, not just referendums, but them working alongside the politicians, not against the politicians, on the things that really need long-term thinking and buy-in for many years is probably what we need.
Thank you. And Matt, your final thoughts?
Yes, I'm going to quote two conservative politicians and then give three examples of where we want to be. And that's not a preference for those political parties. So first of all, Disraeli once said that there is no finality in politics. It's always like a moving thing. We move forward gradually and then we change things. And the way we need to move forward is we have to learn from Ireland. We have to be happy with some of the stuff that we have ourselves, and we have to learn from the Baltic countries. We can learn to deliberate by having the question ironed out and formulated by deliberative fora. So far, so good for Ireland. That's where Ireland is good. Where Ireland is less good is that you can spend literally as much money as you like in Ireland, and you can get away with it. And you can use the internet as much as you like in Ireland, and you can get away with it. In Britain, we have limits for campaign spending, and they were adhered to in the Brexit referendum, and that was a good thing. So the Political Parties Elections and Referendum Act is actually relatively good. It just has not been updated. For example, one of the things with the Brexit referendum was disinformation through the internet, and there were using all sorts of ways in which that could be done. Now, in other countries, they have regulated the use of the of online media. In Estonia, for obvious reasons, because they're right next to Russia, and in Latvia, but also in France, they have restrictions on what you can actually put on the web, and we can learn from that legislation. It's not simple, but it's not the sort of ban things and there has to be fact checking. Like the Australian government is currently introducing a thing which would basically limit free speech, just from a sort of happens to be from a Labour perspective, we would say, in that country. So that's always dangerous. So we should prepare us elements of limits on campaign spending. We should have the Irish aspects of citizens' liberation, and we should learn from the Baltic countries and have regulation of online campaigns. And then sort of coming back to my last conservative person that I want to, another deceased one, and I think we can learn from referendums. We can, learn things by practicing them. And Keith Joseph, who was the education minister under Margaret Thatcher, says, if you give people responsibility, they become responsible. If you take responsibility away from people, they become irresponsible. Now, I pretty much disagree with everything that Keith Joseph has ever said, but I think we need to, in the spirit of compromise and policymaking and solving a problem, we need to design a system where people can be given responsibility so they can become responsible, and that probably starts with local government.
Thank you. And I have the very responsible task of ending this fantastic panel. I first like to thank Meg, Joe, and Matt for what was a fascinating discussion. I'd also like to thank all of you for joining us on your lunch. I hope you had a lovely, lovely sandwich or any other. I'd also like to highlight that in what is far from a taxing decision, we have a special lunch hour on the spring budget, which is next Tuesday, the 12th of March. If you're watching this after the 12th of March, 2024, then I would say you should watch this and every other lunch hour, in addition to a myriad of other fantastic videos that we have on our YouTube channel. So subscribe now. And with that, I'd like to thank our panel again. I'd like to also plug the Constitution Unit, say that we have lots and lots of great commentary and analysis on UK and a changing Europe. Have a wonderful day, everyone.